All right, pre-AP biology. Today we are going to start unit number three. Unit three. Um, so if you're at home, um, this lecture, I'm going to kind of split it up into two different parts. Video part one and then part two. It's just a little bit too much to put into one video. So what I'm going to suggest is that you watch um, video one. Maybe take a little break, whatever, go to lunch, whatever you got to do, go outside. It's probably really nice out today, hopefully, and then come back and watch video two. All right. So this unit is a lot of chemistry. It's a unit on biochemistry, so we talk about like the chemistry of living things. So we're gonna kind of be focusing kind of on the microscopic level of biology, talking about like the elements and the atoms that make up living things. We're going to start off with a definition here of the term matter. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. You probably heard that before. I mean, this manatee here, for example, takes up a lot of space, right? It has mass to it, so it's made of matter. In fact, everything that's inside of this manatee, all of his blood and his heart and his eyeballs and his brain and his spinal cord, everything is made of matter, right? So even the water that's around this manatee is made up of matter. So, pretty much, all living things are made of matter, and you'd be pretty kind of hard pressed to think of anything that is not made of matter. I can think of a few things, things like, for example, light, sound, those things are not made of matter. Energy, heat, for example, is not made of matter. But pretty much anything you come in contact with, I mean, my keys here, my phone, I mean, everything is made up of matter. It has mass. It takes up space. Now, matter, whenever we think of that term, I want the term atoms or atom to come to mind because matter is made up of atoms. It's the smallest particle of matter. There are 92 different types of atoms that occur naturally on Earth. The periodic table, which you'll get a copy of, or you'll have a link to it, there's actually more than 92 elements, but some of those elements are synthetic. They're made in a lab, but there are 92 naturally occurring ones, things like carbon and hydrogen. And remember schnapps, right? Those elements, for example, those are all naturally occurring elements. Now, all the matter that's on our planet, we can kind of categorize it. And that's kind of this is one of the big things I want to talk about in this first video is how do we categorize and classify matter? So we've got a little flow chart here to kind of help us with this, right? So we've got matter at the top, and all matter, we can kind of divide it up into two different categories. We can divide it up into a pure substance or something called a mixture. All right, and then we can even further break it down from there. All right, pure substances can be what we call elements or compounds, and then mixtures can be either what we call heterogeneous or homogeneous. So I'm going to break this down a little bit for you and give you guys a couple of examples here. So an element. Let's first talk about pure substances. These are pure. An element is pure. And an element, really, it just consists of one type of atom. Not one atom, but one type of atom. And for example, this block of gold here, that block of gold is made up of gold atoms, and that's the only thing that there is. There's no carbon, there's no copper, there's no lithium or mercury. It is simply gold, one type of atom. Now, a compound, which is also pure, a compound is more than one atom, but they are chemically bonded to each other. All right, for example, water. Water is a great example of a compound, right? In water, you have hydrogen and you have oxygen. In fact, you have two hydrogens and one oxygen, right? So there's two, it's kind of like a 2-to-1 ratio. Like if you look at the water, you can't see the hydrogen, you can't see the oxygen, but they're there. They're just bonded together, and they form water. I mean, when you drink a glass of water, you're drinking a whole bunch of water molecules, which are these things. Okay, so more than one type of atom, but they must be chemically bonded to each other. We typically, whenever we are distinguishing compounds, we write like formulas for them, like H2O, CO2, NaCl, glucose, right? C6H12O6. Compounds have formulas. Remember that. That if you see a formula, that it's a compound no matter what. CO2, a good example of a compound. Now, mixtures are a little bit different. Okay, now mixtures are more than one substance. Now, in a heterogeneous mixture, great example, one of my favorites, right, is a pizza. I mean, you can see the substances, right? You can see the sausage and the pepperoni and the mushrooms and the sauce and the cheese. I'm getting hungry, right? And you can see them. So in a heterogeneous mixture, just remember you can see the different parts, right? Um, a chocolate chip cookie, right? You can see different components, right? You can see the chips and the dough, right? Whatever. So in a heterogeneous mixture, there's more than one substance, and it's not the same throughout. So like if you cut this pizza into, let's say, 8 slices, one slice might have more mushrooms on it, another slice might have more cheese on it, another one might, I don't know, have a little bit less sauce than the other one, whatever, right? I mean, a heterogeneous mixture is not the same throughout, but you can see the different components. Okay, that's what a heterogeneous mixture is. Now, a homogeneous mixture is again more than one substance, but it's the same throughout. I mean, for example, in a, say, ketchup bottle, right? Think about what makes up ketchup, right? You've got tomatoes or tomato paste, you got sugar, you got salt, you got water, but when they're all mixed together, you can't really see the individual components. If you squirted ketchup all over your desk or something, I mean, it all looks like the same thing. It's all the same substance, but there are more than one substance in that ketchup, right? There are more, there's ingredients. So whenever I think about a mixture, I always think about the word ingredients. In a heterogeneous mixture, you can see the ingredients. In a homogeneous mixture, you can't. All right. So if that kind of makes sense to you, now don't always think that it's food. Mixtures aren't always food, but food I think is a good example, a good way to explain what mixtures are. All right. So just remember matter, two different types, pure or a mixture. If it's pure, it's an element or a compound. If it's a mixture, it's either heterogeneous or homogeneous. All right. So kind of going back to a couple of these terms, elements, right? They're pure. They're made up of one type of atom. Periodic table of the elements. All right. You either have a hard copy of this that you picked up in class, or there's a link to one on Buzz in the agenda. I do want you to get familiar with some of these element symbols. This isn't a very big list. There's like maybe 15 or 20 here. In fact, some of them are your schnapps elements that you should know already. But I did add a couple of them to the list just because I think that these are good biology elements to know. We'll talk about iron, for example, and zinc, and mercury this year in class a little bit. So I want you to kind of be familiar with those. But these are the only ones that you really have to know. So make sure you know the symbols. Make sure you know the term. Again, when you're writing symbols, remember, the first letter is always capitalized, second letter is always lowercase. You must distinguish between a capital letter and a lowercase letter. If I can't tell them apart, then I'm going to count it wrong. So make sure you do that. If they're single letter elements, then the letter is always capitalized. Okay. Another thing that I want you to be able to be, or at least be able to do, this really isn't too difficult, but whenever you see a formula, like for a compound, like H2O or sodium chloride or glucose or something. Let's just say glucose, for example. Okay. When you see a formula, I fully expect you, especially the ones that I've given you, I fully expect you to know those element symbols. So like you should know that glucose is made up of carbon, it's made up of hydrogen, and it's made up of oxygen, right? Those three elements are in glucose. You also should know the ratio of those elements. So if there's 6 carbons to 12 hydrogens to 6 oxygens, that's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. All right, so I expect you to be able to do things like that. That's something that pre-AP biology students should be able to handle. I've talked about this before, I believe. The properties of a compound are different from the elements that make it up, right? For example, sodium chloride, like we know some of the properties of table salt, right? Put it on your French fries, right? Tastes good. But there's two elements, right, that are in sodium chloride. Sodium, which is a metal, actually. It's actually very reactive. It's very explosive. This metal is kind of like a shiny, silvery solid, but it's actually almost like butter. You can like cut through it. But if you were holding it in your hand, it would be very reactive. It would be shooting out sparks and flames and probably catch your hand on fire. You probably wouldn't want to be holding this stuff in your hand. This is chlorine gas, which is kind of a yellowish green um, um, chemical element, but it's also highly poisonous. If you breathe this in, you can die. Okay, but if you combine those two things together in a 1 to 1 ratio, you get table salt, right? So the properties of a compound are different from the elements that make it up. I think that goes to show you. Again, chemical formulas, make sure we know types of atoms, numbers of atoms in a molecule. So that little number there is called a subscript. All right, a subscript is always written after the element. So in CO2, for example, you've got 1 carbon. If you don't see a number there, then there's one of them. So there's 1 carbon for every 2 oxygens. Occasionally you'll see a number written in front. So let's say I put a 4 in front here. All that number would mean is that there's 4 carbon dioxides. So that means you would have 4 carbons, because 4 times 1 would be 4. Then 4 times 2, you'd have 8 oxygens. All right, so if you have a number out front, that's called the coefficient. You just multiply the coefficient by the subscript to figure out what the total number of atoms is. All right, guys, I'm going to stop it here today, and then we'll pick up with part 2 in the next video.